Hi, my name is Philip Bither, Curator for Performing Arts here at the Walker Arts Center, and with me today is Miguel Gutierrez, who just premiered 2 nights ago and Lose the Name of Action, your new work, which we were reminiscing. It was just about a little over 3 years ago when we first talked about your next piece. Actually, this is a question I was going to ask you later, but this idea of having an open-ended request. I loved your work so much, the pieces I had seen, and everyone was here a number of years ago, that I just wanted to do whatever we could to be part of your next piece. But I read recently in an interview you said, most of my works I do because someone asked me to do something specifically. How do you feel about an open-ended invitation to just support whatever it is you next want to do? You had some early germs of ideas versus a specific, like, can you make a 12-minute work that X, Y, Z?
Yeah, I think, I think anything that allows you to imagine is a great thing, So when someone says, hey, we want to support X, or, we want to support your next project, or we want to support you doing this, that, there's a couple different feelings that you have. One is kind of like, oh boy, I gotta do something else. It's like, oh, I better think of something. But then the second, usually the next layer of feelings, it's like, okay, great, I get to imagine. And I think for a long time, I just didn't conceive of how timelines worked in terms of a trajectory of making work. Like, I just thought, okay, it's only about this thing that you're making, and making that thing, realizing that piece, and trying to get people to that one piece, and boom. And then about a couple of years ago, maybe around that time that you approached me, but I feel like maybe it had kind of started to happen a tiny bit before that too, there was suddenly this shift from making something, putting everything into that one thing, doing that, and then being like, what am I going to do next, to making something, and then even as that's being made, or as it's approaching its own finishing point, to be thinking about the next thing. And that was a huge transformation for me.
Difficult?
Yes, it is difficult. Because on the one hand, you're having this kind of relationship to the thing you're doing, and you're thinking, well, this is it. This is the energy I want to, all of my thinking, all of my passion wants to go to just this one thing. I don't want to have to think about anything else. And then at the same time, inevitably, because of the nature of making, or maybe it's the nature of insecurity, or imagination, where you're like, well, maybe in the next piece I'm going to really be able to hit this mark, or I'm going to be able to imagine X, Y, and Z that I wasn't able to realize in this piece, or I think because making over time is such you're in this kind of weird devil's advocate relationship with yourself. Whereas you're finishing something, you're like, I made this, and look at this and this and this and this about it. What would be the opposite of that? Or what would, what if I were to go in this other direction with that? Or if I were to take this and go. So it's hard not to, because you do that with anything that you see, right? Like as an artist, you sort of have a response to things that you're seeing, that you kind of react to, or you think, I would go in this direction with that, or I would think that. And then when you start to do that with your own work, it's really strange, Partly because for me, I have like this anxiety where I don't ever want to be perceived in one way.
So did you see this piece, either consciously or unconsciously, especially now that we've premiered it, as a departure from your past work, or as a part of a continuum?
I think this piece feels very much like a continuum, specifically from Last Meadow. I think, and in that regard, it's been a very strange thing for me to do, because I think up until that moment, every piece always felt like it was totally a rejection of the prior piece. Content-wise, or approach, or there was just like a real sense of like, okay, done, next. There was this real kind of turn the car. And I realized with Last Meadow that I had more to explore just conceptually about what had come up, because I had just started to understand a little bit about this tension that was present in like the history of philosophy around the way the body was being talked about, and specifically the situation with my father had it was just sort of getting going in terms of my father having neurological difficulties, and so I was just beginning to really understand something about that.
And were you doing specific research as your father was becoming aware of what he was struggling with around brain function? And
yeah, I mean, I
sense?
did like a really generic thing where I just like got a DVD series about the brain and started watching that, and like it was kind of dull and and tedious, but I would be like, okay, I'm gonna try to watch this next lecture, and some of them were really interesting. Some of them were like, oh, I can't, like I'm obviously not a neuroscientist,
And there's this book that you also have referred to around mind-body relationship and body
The
and
Meaning of the
dance.
Body, which is this Mark Johnson book, was very influential for me at the beginning, and reading about perception and embodiment and the role of the body and perception and embodiment was to read that coming from that perspective of he's, I guess, this philosopher, linguist kind of person, and was both really central, but also, I think that also kind of got me like frustrated because I felt like, okay, why aren't you talking about dance, or why are your references to dance so paltry, or in my experience of the writing that, he may be like an expert on it now, who knows, but at that time I felt like there was such an absence of a conversation around somatically influenced dance, which feels like it's a very rich, long history now. But I mean, throughout the research of this project, I became very aware of the fact that these fields are really distinct from each other. You know, the field of philosophy, the field of neuroscience, the field of somatics, and even though all of them are sort of talking around the same things, it doesn't seem like it's the case that they often are talking to each other.
Right. It seemed like in the work too, even though as you developed it, you referenced neuroscience and the paranormal and the spiritualist movement and other things that I saw throughout the work. It seemed like a lot of the work was also about the limitations around language and the failure of language as well.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, it's so funny, it's been now present in the last couple of pieces, it feels like. Definitely in Last Meadow and Heavens, What Have I Done, I feel like. And maybe even back to Retrospective Exhibitionist or something. Which is funny because I love words, I really am a fan of words, and
you're a poet.
I write poetry, and that's like a really something that's a long-standing practice in my life, and journal writing, like so many people, and reading. I like to read, so words. I'm not averse to language, and I think I'm very sensitive to the power of language. And as a teacher, I'm very sensitive to how I use words. Now that I'm training to become a Feldenkrais practitioner, words are huge, and the way you deliver language is a very huge part of that training.
You're training to be, I'm sorry?
Become a Feldenkrais method practitioner. It's kind of body work.
Oh, okay.
And I mean, again, the nature of that work is there's two ways in which it's approached. Either you work one-on-one with a person where you don't have to talk so much, or you do group lessons, and so you're very, you're talking and you're not demonstrating really.
Right.
So you're just really being specific about how you're saying things and the timing of them, the rhythm, the tone, which is something that you consider always as a teacher. You're not going to walk into a dance class and the first half hour be like, okay, get on the floor, you're not going to yell at people. You're going to kind of hypnotize them into relaxation.
So in some ways, it's a lot about how language is used without necessarily what the content of the words.
It is and it isn't. I mean, it's a consciousness around the textural and sonic oral value of sound of words, which I think for me has always been the case. I mean, I know that when I go see plays, which I don't do super often, but when I go see plays, there is a moment when I'm like, I just don't hear what's being said. I literally, it just becomes, it's almost like I have what I imagine a dissociative relationship or a neurological aphasia thing where suddenly it just sounds, and I'm just conscious okay, her sounds seem kind of louder and his sounds seem kind of softer, and I get just kind of, I just trip out on the just the like vibratory quality of the sound, and I think I get really interested in the choreographic value of sound, and the way in which words, they don't just sort of convey meaning, although that is sort of considered to be their primary function, but they also they just propose a kind of texture in a space, you know, and in this piece, you know, you walk in and there are words that are being said.
I was going to ask, it's so interesting in reference to what you just said. Often I found in the piece the language both beautiful and sort of unintelligible in a certain way. The words themselves, I kept trying to sort of left brain it and put it together, and what does that mean exactly? But I found it elusive and elliptical kind of, and that seemed to in some ways set the tone for the work, because it made people question language in general. And it was, I mean, maybe, I don't know if you want to speak about that intentionality or not.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting, you know, we're working with Baru, Brian O'Connell, on this piece, and I feel like a lot of what Baru's work is with language is, I think he does go very meta with it and see that language is an object, and that can be moved around and located and placed and shifted, and can sort of offer a very sort of blunt truth, but obliquely.
Right.
And then at the same time, you're getting kind of caught up not only in the meaning of the word or the words, but you're also getting kind of caught up in the tendril and the directionality of the word and the language of words. Like it's kind of putting you here and then it's kind of taking you elsewhere, which again, I feel like is a choreographic act, you know? It's like this, it just kind of moves somewhere, and you're like, wait, I thought it was here, but actually now I'm over here, and because
or sometimes something's stated and then it's directly contradicted.
Yeah,
it's this and it's not
exactly,
that.
and it's
then
not
you're
that,
like,
and
then
like,
what is it?
Yeah, and I think there's something really corporeal about that, because, and as you say, I think when people hear words on stages, they want to I mean, it's obvious they want to understand them. Like that's like the first thing you imagine, and you know, certainly if you're coming from a conventional theatrical perspective, there's this thing of like, well, words are meant to be heard, and duh. But I often am more intrigued by the words that aren't heard, or the words that are smeared, or the words that are, you know, sometimes, you know, when things are kind of kept at bay, I think as a subject of experiencing that as a viewer, you're kind of like, wait, what? What is that? And you get caught up in this thing of like advancing and retreating and getting frustrated, and then kind of, and this was a huge value of Last Meadow as well, hopefully at some point maybe surrendering to the fact that you're not going to get it, you know, and it's like a bit of a trick to say like, oh yeah, you thought the words were going to ground you, but maybe there's like a thing that's like happening and it's not happening. You know, it's like if you're at a cocktail party or, you know, a dinner party, and, you know, you're talking to someone, but you're conscious that other people are talking, and then suddenly someone else's conversation seems a lot more interesting than the one that you're having, and you're kind of like, what's happening?
And you're nodding,
and
but
you're
really
like,
listening to this
somewhere
person.
else, and you know, and this happens all the time now, where we are in multiple places linguistically at once, you know, and we're not. You know, we're no longer just in this, very rarely are we in this one-on-one understanding, you understand me, back and forth. And even when you are in that space, you're getting so much information from the spaces in between things. And you're picking up so much from the language of the, you know, the body language, the space, the tone, the, you know, the energetic perception of this person's even present or not, whether they're comfortable or not. So, you know, this idea that words alone are these kinds of rational messengers is so incomplete. You know,
and it also seems in some ways to, you know, you've spoken often, and I think at times the dance community sees you as in recent years kind of a defender of the form, and you've talked about its second-class status in the art world and things. And in some ways, it seems like a very savvy, strategic move in the making of a work to allow language to, in some ways, be more elusive and therefore opening up the power of movement,
Yeah.
but also balancing those things in some way.
Yeah, I do think that's interesting, because it does kind of put words on their heads a bit, and I think, because the thing that the criticism that's often launched at dance, or the sort of, cliche criticism that's put at it is like, oh, it's like abstract and it can't be understood and it's elitist and it's blah, 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 this kind of stuff, which, okay, yes, we can go down that road, I suppose. I choose not to go there. I mean, for better or for worse, movement is something that I have a really intimate relationship to at this point. And so I do have a relationship to comprehension of it. Like, I understand something about it, even though I know that it's not about understanding. So it's this very intriguing place for me, and I don't feel that anxiety, that I know many people feel, and I understand why you would feel it. I understand that, like, somebody getting up on stage and being like, and they'd be like, what the fuck does that mean? Like, I can totally understand that someone would wonder what that is. And I think as a maker of work, you have to sort of decide where you land in that, whether what you're doing is representational or abstract or sort of combination of the two, or, whether you want this thing to be solid and sort of grounded, whether you're referring to this canon of a dance history and a recognizable vocabulary, or whether you're coming at it from a different perspective. And there's so many different ways to engage the history of movement in a work, and I guess I feel, I don't know, I feel so many different ways about it, depending on whether it even lands, where it lands even in a piece,
Sure.
Like, I don't think, it's never been the case that I've been, constructing a vocabulary that is necessarily recognizable as, oh, well, Miguel Gutierrez, that's the Miguel Gutierrez move.
Right.
Although, sure, I have my moves, like any mover does. But that hasn't been the central concern ever of the work. Instead, it's been about harnessing something about the elusive nature of movement as a language, and resisting that entirely, and instead kind of toying with it more from this place of, it's just another way of perceiving space and time and situation,
Which is kind of interesting in your position in the art world today, because on the one hand, there's so many contradictions or interesting dynamic tensions in your work and in your position as an artist. One is kind of leading a rallying cry to defend dance as an art form, and on the other hand, your work sort of extends beyond what many people's definition of dance is. And I know you've even said sometimes going to see dance, you're both completely excited at times and completely bored at other times. And so do you position yourself in the dance world still to this day, or would you say that?
Oh yeah, I mean, I'm suddenly reminded of Shirley MacLaine. Like, I remember reading an interview with Shirley MacLaine in Time magazine in the 80s, and she was like, at heart, I'm a dancer, and I remember being like, yes, Shirley, I feel the same way, like, despite all the films. No, I think I do, although I often then end up in situations that I guess are more considered like the dance world, and I'm like, oh, weird, is this what I live? Like, is this where I live?
Right.
I think I will always, have that desire to, like, when I walk into an empty room, to, like, get on the floor and roll around and, like, check in with how the fuck I'm feeling.
Physically.
Which for me, physically, which feels like such a basic dancer value. And I do have this basic sense of, like, desiring a kind of physical sense of place, which is different than, like, if I were just to go to the gym or, exercise. There's a different kind of intelligence that you're tapping into through a physical practice that comes out of the corner of the dance world that I have come up in, because obviously there's many dance worlds. You can't just say there's one.
Especially today. I mean,
So, am I inside of like the show dance world? No. Am I like doing a kind of more specific folkloric kind of form? Yes, but not, the one that we
Right.
conventionally consider folkloric.
Sure.
In terms of like a nationality-based one.
There were moments in the piece where I felt like Cunningham and Cage's definition around too much to look at and think no center place seemed to really resonate in moments in the work. And then at other times, kind of modern and postmodern dance's distrust of emotion and its kind of post-60s sense of not really wanting to manipulate an emotional response contrasted with the emotionality that I feel and others in senior work is really an interesting dynamic tension. And I don't know, I know this is a little bit off of what we were just talking about. If you'd want to talk about, there you both have drawing from elements of certainly pre-Judson and post-Judson movement, but at the same token, your work evokes a kind of an immediate, a kind of emotional response in many audience members, and how you feel, how do you navigate those
It's scary
waters?
to do that, to propose it, because I know it's not, it doesn't fit into a certain lineage of art history, right? So it doesn't necessarily fit into like the minimalist lineage or even the sort of the Judson, post-Judson lineage per se.
Or visual art.
Or the visual art.
Contemporary visual art world.
It doesn't, when I get anxious about that, I remember that I am born of Colombian parents, and that actually gives me a lot of grounding to remember that, like, there is, people were like, well, you're Latin American, how does that, reveal itself in your work? And I'm like, yeah, I'm not like, I'm Colombian, I'm not like making work like I'm Colombian. But, but there is something very specific about a kind of relationship to emotion that is, I think, very grounded in my ethnic heritage, that I feel really unapologetic about.
More so than part of a generational shift in the dance performance world where you're kind of leading, because I see other people influenced by now, your willingness to have that aspect emerge from your work.
Yeah, and which is, sometimes I've seen that I'm kind of like, like, it's funny, I'm like, oh gosh, please don't do the thing I'm doing, I can want to be all cool and, distanced.
Formal.
And but I think it's false to divide these things. To say that there's formalism is somehow an unemotional space. It's the same division we're making between mind and body. To say that somehow there's either kind of like hysterical emotion or there's like, legible rationality. And I hate those divisions. I absolutely reject them entirely. There is a formalism to emotion. I think, particularly in my work, because it's repeated, to assume that somehow it's just like this constant, pure emotion, it would be false. There's a virtuosity to the construction of emotion, and there's a plasticity to it, and that manipulation that you're talking about, that manipulation happens in any artwork, really, and anybody who says they're not trying to do that, I don't know that I buy it. There's a kind of, you are creating something for impact of some kind. Now, you can decide that you just know what the impact is going to be, and that's a particular notion of a manipulation, right? Which is the more Hollywood film sort of
Broadway
convention.
show.
That's like, it's going to make you happy. Like, I don't presume to know what the emotional impact is going to be of the individual viewer. Like, that's actually something I don't do. But I do listen to and pay attention to the kind of rhythmic emotionalism that's happening over the span of time of a piece, and say, okay, we've been in this tone, and now it's time to get hot, now it's time to cool down, now it's time to heat up again. Now heating up in this case will look like this. And now, and I think to say the word emotion is to not acknowledge sometimes that there are multiple emotions. To just say like, oh, the work is emotional. It's like, well, what the fuck does that mean? Because what isn't really? What isn't emotional? Like, a minimalist is making emotional work.
And empathy with the body can be emotional just on a purist
absolutely,
kind of sense.
Absolutely. And conceptualism is not, I don't think it should be relegated or monopolized by sort of like ideas that are detached from context, and to make emotional work or to make counting-based work or to make representational work, that's conceptual proposition. It just happens to be a particular relationship to concepts. And I think I've had to release myself from this anxiety that if the work doesn't have a coolness, that it won't be appreciated as a contemporary form. And I think that but I'm also like a New York kid, I'm also like a person who's come up inside of New York, which, as we all know, is a real, bastion of that kind of cool formalism, as opposed to the history of art forms or dance forms in other countries and other cities in America. So I'm in a bit of a struggle there. I often kind of go back and forth, and the more that I travel with my work and the more that I see work in other places, when I am back in New York and when I see work that feels like it's very much coming up through the New York lineage, I often am aware of how regionalist it looks. And I'm like, oh, it is really aligned with a particular sort of idea of neutrality or a proposition around coolness. And and people will say that about New York dance and other places. They'll sort of comment on the way people perform work, and I don't know if that's still the case, but certainly I remember coming up in the '90s and hearing that a lot. But I think with my work, I've sort of have released myself from that, and I'm much more intrigued by absorbing all of those histories as we do as artists. Not because I feel like I'm in as much of a lineage. I'm in as much a conversation with like the post-Judson era as I am with like '80s East Village PS 122 history. Like
performance
Ishmael
history.
and Tim Miller and all, Karen Finley and that kind of stuff. And I'm also in conversation with, 60s actionism and then 1970s, performance art and,
pop culture
or or club performance that I saw as a, young queer person in the 90s in San Francisco. It's like those, I don't feel relegated to this one lineage. I'm super conscious of a kind of collegistic absorption of those things and also embracing the spectacle. There's been so much like against spectacle in the last few years, particularly out of Europe, where there's a real sort of marriage between a sort of like economic relationship to presentation and and a rejection of a certain kind of idea of theatricality and putting those two things in the same basket. And I'm not doing that. So that confuses people.
Right.
Because they think, okay, well, if he's not doing that, then he must be doing this. And it's like, but then they see the work and they're like, they know that it's smart.
Right.
Like they can't deny that it's smart.
Yeah.
So they're like, fuck, we can't just put him in the like, theatrical campy camp, So
and even the
weird.
nature of the whole conversation and my questions to you might be an indication, case study on the limitation of language and labels, and how easy it is to just end up narrowing down into a single definition, one thing. When you were talking about the ebb and flow of the way you make your work, I wondered if we could move to and lose and its structure, because it's seeing it now back to back twice. It's really interesting to see how, on one level, it feels unstructured and almost like you never, like things just bubble forth, almost like the way a dream might happen. On the other hand, watching you work on it and then seeing it again, it's so carefully structured. Can you talk about how difficult it may have been to capture both sides, or how you did decide to structure the work and what came after, what came next in the piece?
Sure. I have like a really, I'm very interested in time. I'm very interested in the fact that in performance, or at least the way that I work with performance, I'll speak for myself, in theater, that you are, in a way, hijacking people's time. You're kidnapping them, hopefully willingly, but you were saying, okay, here's the next hour and a half of all of our lives, and
which is a particular distinction between a visual art or an installation.
Very different. Oh my God, it's so different. And it's often like, It's funny, you know, again, one of the sort of things that's out there in the world is like that it's like terrible that we like force people and the viewer is this passive person and blah, 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 this anti-theater shit you hear all the time,
Right.
which I just like, I mean, sure, yeah, I've had that experience too of sitting in a theater and feeling really disempowered, but I've also had the experience of walking into a museum and feeling really distracted, you know, and feeling kind of like I can't land anywhere. Or you go and you see a video artist's work in a museum and you know the video is like 7 minutes and you're in there for 15 seconds.
Right.
And you're kind of like, nah.
Well, and there is,
you know?
we're seeing a lot of visual artists really wanting to make work in a theater setting.
Exactly. They want people's attention. Yeah, right. Hello, you know, it's like
Same
part
with filmmakers.
of like,
they want, or you know, art video filmmakers want to have their work shown in a
and
theatrical
a theater,
setting.
because they're like, let me get your ass in the chair for 2 hours.
Right.
You know, because that's ritual. Because ritual takes time. Ceremony takes time. It's not the same. It's not the same to just kind of like sit there. And you know, when I go to museums, I often treat them as theaters. I'll go and I'll look at a painting for 5 fucking minutes. Like I'll sit in front of it and be like, what is happening here?
Which requires a different kind of self-discipline.
It's a completely different kind of a way of seeing. It's a particular attention. Now, it's not the mode of attention that is popular right now in the world. So I've been saying this recently, and it's like a very scary thing to say out loud, but it's like, yeah, in a way I feel like a conservator, you know, or like I meant...
Of collective ritual.
Yeah, and also like of an ancient practice.
Right.
You know, to say like, yeah, we're gonna kind of sit with ourselves. You know, in the way that meditation is really uncomfortable, but you know, you get more from meditation if you do it for 15 minutes than if you do it for 1. You know, and I just think like there's a value to placing that much reflectivity, or the possibility for that much reflection is really important. So fine. So that's just like my stupid treatise on time. And in relationship to when I make a show, you know, I also, for better or for worse, have this idea around time, which is like, well, see, if I have you for X amount of time, probably you should have lots of different feelings. You know, like you know, like probably it shouldn't just be like one feeling.
For an hour and a half.
Exactly. You know, and I wish I could find a better word. You know, I don't like maximalism is one word you could say. Sure, like I like to give a lot, but I don't think it's as simple as that either. I just think it's about. And maybe this is my nod to like Broadway or spectacle or histories of spectacle, or even movies actually, and novels. You know, I think for this piece I got so much freedom from reading, ironically enough, the book Freedom by Jonathan Franzen.
Sure.
Because I remember reading that book, and you know, I know there's lots of criticisms of that book, but I was like, wow, he's so ambitious. Like he gives himself so much permission to include so much shit in this book. And that's kind of what I want to do with my work. Like, I don't want to just like, okay, find the kernel. No, it's not about the kernel. That's not the way I live my life. That's not the way my mind works, you know? As probably evidenced by this interview. It's like, I'm like, blah, 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 all these things. And it's like, I am interested in these associative things. And so for me, structure over time becomes this kind of like layering and presentation of multiple possibilities. And the structure is defined by the relationships between those experiences and how they relate to each other in the moment and between themselves, and then also how they accumulate over the course of the evening, so that then at the end you have this responsibility in a way as a viewer to kind of reflect. And I've heard, you know, this isn't just me hopefully tooting my own horn, but I have been told by many people over the course of the years of making work that a lot of people are like, I have to just think about what I just saw, you know, or I hated it and then I couldn't stop thinking about it, and a week later I was like, huh, like, you know, and like that. It seems like I do a thing to people where I do present a certain kind of logjam, you know, and then it's kind of like, okay, now you go deal with this, you know, and then they kind of like parse things out, and, you know, and I do wish in a way that, you know, like I said, I was really happy you came twice, because I felt like, you know, I know it's complicated. Yeah. Like, I know it's too much a lot of times. I'm like, oh God, you know, I pity the person who's trying to like understand this at once, because I do feel like there is something about kind of returning to it and the density of what's happening in it. And so in terms of then how I lay it out, you know, that's just intuition. And sometimes it's tactical. Sometimes it's really like Cage Cunningham, like, let's just put this here and not even, you know.
And sometimes I would take it that as you have different pieces and you're putting them in different orders, that you've come to really trust your own intuition.
Oh, you have to, yeah, you have to. But also, you know, you're not alone. You know, when you're making a group work, there's people in the room who are smart and have opinions, and you can invite them to say, well, what do you guys think of this here? And, you know, the piece opens with this little duet between me and Ish. And at some point, that was sort of like in the middle of the piece. And putting it in the middle of the piece was like, it was just too treacly and sentimental. And I mean, it is sentimental, but it's like, but instead I was like, oh no, this is a prologue. This is sort of like what everything about the piece is about in a way is in this little moment. And it can be kind of this, you know, prologue thing. And I was really pleased with that. Because before we used to start with just the entering and the singing, which I think was a little like, what's going on here, you know? So I think I am very conscious of, again, I said this word already, but like the invitation in a performance, like where, you know, you make an invitation in a way as you know, if you make something that exists over time. And you can choose as a director or as a performance maker to decide how you want to deal with it. If you don't want to make an invitation, you know, there are some artists who I think who are very effective at kind of really pushing you, and you have to really like contend with that sense of the push. There are people who really spend time doing this in a way that sometimes you're like, ugh, you're also rejected. You're like, fuck you, I don't want to be invited in that way. You know, I'm sort of a little bit of both. I'm like, I'm going to invite you, but it's not going to be safe. Let's say, like, it's going to be safe and it's not going to be safe. And
you have to work a little bit to find the treasures. You know, they reveal themselves, but you need to lean forward.
Yeah, which is tough. You know, it's a lot. It is a lot to ask. I know that it's not.
But you're absolutely right in that it gives so much after the fact as well. I mean, the people, I was talking about it all evening after the first night and into the early hours because it hangs with you. And you want to go back and see Why was it so important to have this particular configuration?
I think I just, you know, early on when we had our first residency here at the Walker last year, was just I knew even before that actually I had already thought to myself, well, I really want this show to be seen from multiple sides. Like I just no real reason. I just suddenly I was very aware of seeing performances where I was just feeling so oppressed by frontality. You know, and this is something, you know, something like Deborah Hay talks about this, and you know, Cunningham certainly has, you know, talked about this. And even though, you know, Cunningham pieces, many of the theater pieces are seen from the front, but there's a notion and a value around multiplicity of direction, right, in that stuff. But I guess I was seeing a lot of shows where I was just like, I get it, I'm over here, you're over there, and everything, the important shit has to face me. You know, it was just driving me bananas. So I thought, okay, well, I really want to just like not do that. So fine. And then I was like, okay, well, what are the different options, right? What are the things we know, like go in the round, you know, one side, two sides, three sides, four sides, you know. And I was like, okay, what have I've experienced all those things. And then I think something about the fact that the piece, at least in the process, was about attempting to see things in just a different perspective. Like things that you kind of always see this way, literally trying to do this to them, like conceptually. One day we were in here and I was just like, well, what have I not, what sort of setup have I not really experienced so much, you know? And then this kind of skewed square or whatever, trapezoid thing kind of revealed itself, and I was like, oh yeah, I haven't, I don't remember sitting in an audience where that was experienced. I mean, I'm sure Anna Halpern did it in like 1960. But
no, I mean, really for us, we've played around a lot with the theater. In fact, one of the other times it was really fun was when everyone was here.
When we did everyone here,
And just 2 rows in the back. But we have never had this setup, and it really, although not totally easy, was a pleasure to have the space feeling really different. And I love when audiences can come on thinking they know a space so well already, and then they feel completely in a different kind of room.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's also, and I think it's kind of also harkens back to this other thing of like site specific. What is site specific work?
Yeah.
You know, and
Right.
I'm like, for me, it's like any theater is site specific work. You know,
although you do have the challenge now to take this.
Oh yeah, that challenge is like, I mean, it's funny because you have these like great ideas, and then it's like, and then you're kind of like screwed by them. You're like,
by the logistics.
oh my God,
right.
now I have to
freight bills or whatever.
Yeah,
it is,
and you realize I'm like, oh man, I really wish that in school they would teach you how to look at a plot and like at a theater design to be able to say like, how is this going to work? Like that's the one skill like you never learn until you're in it. And but I'm lucky to have pretty awesome people to work with on that front. So.
Was proximity important too? I mean, that sense of not having everyone within a certain number of feet of the actual performers.
It feels pretty important for this. Often in general for my work, it feels like it's really important. Although certainly I think like Last Meadow has a thing where you can kind of experience it from afar because it is in the box. But I feel like this show wanted to have a kind of intimacy, a seance-y intimacy to it.
And then the physical design with soft goods and the parachute above us, and the sense of almost, and the use of light transforming perception.
Yeah.
And, could you talk a little bit about those aspects?
Yeah, I think also early on, I rarely do this, but I started doing little drawings in my notebook of like, it would be kind of cool to imagine this. And like early on, I was like, I want there to be video, which I was like, whoa, that is a really, that's usually like,
why did you say that?
That I wanted it? I have no fucking clue. I mean, again,
just you hadn't played around with it that
I'd
much.
done it a tiny little bit in one piece, like many, many years ago. I Succumb, a piece from 2003. I used video that I made in a solo that like was like seen once called My Endless Love in 2006. But I had never like gone like the full on like projection route with a piece of mine so much. And I always have felt like it's like sometimes the world's worst idea to have that in a dance piece. But I don't know. It was like, again, like you can't, I don't know. You can't like not listen to these weird voices, you know? Like I was like, I feel like I'm supposed to work with a video artist. I don't know why. So like my feelers were out there. And then 2 years ago at Mount Tremper in New York, I met Boru. I saw his work. And I just like instantly had a really strong feeling about it. Right. And I was like, something about what he's doing with this is really interesting. And, I approached him and again, I was pretty clear, like, look, the world that I come from is really different than the visual art world. And, it takes time, and it's like, we work in theaters, and theaters are really tricky, and they have to be really, has to be adaptable. And I think it's been a real learning curve for him, too, because I think it's a different expectation. But, I don't know. I've been really thrilled, actually, about how it's gone. And it feels really integral to the piece. So that aspect. But then the parachute, I've worked with Lenore Doxey for 11 years, 12 years.
Lenore did obviously the beautiful lighting, but she was also involved with you on the whole design.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, Lenore is like Lenore can kind of do it all. She's like mind-blowing, just unbelievable artist, and I know she's worked with Morgan Thorson here and Karen Sherman. And, so I feel like she's like, I mean, she isn't the unsung hero. She's received a Bessie for my work a couple times now, but it's like she's just like, I just think she's just unbelievably brilliant. And I was really obsessed with, a couple years ago, I got really obsessed with light boxes and like photo light boxes and these kinds of lights, like this kind of like bounce light. And I was really like having an focus light moment. Really intense. But I was like, I don't want to just do the like all white light. The way people usually respond to that is like, they just like, we'll turn all the white lights on. Right, or get some fluorescence going, or,
Or a sort of foresight, like use airplane hangar lights.
Yes, exactly. So there's like these kinds of responses, and I was like, well, there is something really romantic about that incandescent light that can be beautiful. And so I said to her, I was like, look, I just can't, like, I'm really obsessed with this kind of light boxy light. And so she just made like the biggest light box you possibly could imagine, and then, she did this thing also where she's she's pointing light at fabric that then reflects back
Right.
down. So, which I saw, she also did that in a show that I saw of, you know, in the theater company that she's associated with in New York, Target Margin. They did a version of Tempest, and she did all this bounce card type of lighting where you light at the ceiling and it kind of reflects down, and it just creates this incredible kind of
Like a glow
disseminated
version,
light
yeah.
that's a glow, which felt for this piece, because of the sort of investigation of the ghosty stuff and the spiritualist movement stuff, you know, so much of what you read about there is the use of light. And so I just thought, okay, it's nice because it takes us away from this idea of focused specials. Like, I mean, we have specials in this piece and stuff, but it does this other kind of, it's just a different quality.
Yeah.
And it kind of, it diffuses things, and it kind of makes things just seem a little like somehow real and unreal in a really different way. Light is often so used to sort of like sculpt and kind of locate the performer and really solidify them. And I was like, well, how do we still, you know, see people, but also kind of like, how do they kind of, how do we sort of connect the space between their boundary of their body and the surrounding space? And part of how you can do that is diffusing the light. So, and playing with the tension between, you know, so we have this light here that kind of at times comes up, and it's a very fiery kind
Right.
of specific yellowy amber thing, and then you have this kind of all these sort of rich, completely saturated, the entire space is saturated in colors, which is very unusual.
Yeah.
You know, but she's a real master of that.
And you also have, which is a different, it serves a different role, but the small white box that
Yes.
has light in it.
Yeah,
And,
yeah, totally.
And it seems to speak in so many different ways in
Yeah.
the piece.
Yeah. Sort of like the meaning of the universe in
Yes.
that box kind of thing.
Right.
Yeah.
You also, by having surround, the faces and the energy of the individuals in the house and the collective seems more present, obviously, than in other pieces. Was that something that that you looked for initially when you thought about a reconfigured space, that you do the bodies would also add this whole visual component?
Yeah, I always think it's interesting to like either I would love to see a show where I could be like fully independent of anyone else's like presence. You know, I've often seen shows where I'm so annoyed by that person with the cough, or that person with the wrapper,
Right.
or that annoying person who's checking their fucking phone,
Or someone
to see
who's
what time
sighing
it is.
deeply, or
yeah,
so-
like, and it's like sometimes I think, oh, I want to be in those like movie type seats, but like also like I'm at an amusement park and you're in those rides where they have to surround you so
Right.
you don't like fall out. Like I've seen shows where I'm like, God, I really wish I could, or I want to be really conscious of the fact that we're all here together. Like
Right.
like it's like either or. I either want to see it by myself,
Right.
or I want to be like, okay, you know what, we're all here.
Yeah.
Like we can't ignore the fact that we're all here.
And was
So-
that partly why that beautiful moment where the choral work comes in and
Yeah,
everyone, you ask everyone to, you know,
hold
everyone
hands.
ends up holding hands?
Yeah. I think it's really, I mean, it's been kind of unbelievable to me that almost like everyone seems to be doing it. I was like, I don't know, people are gonna be like, what the hell? And but people do, yeah. I think it's kind of.
I actually see a lot of really smiles on people's faces. And
I think
people
they're kind
seem
of
to really
relieved.
like it.
You
yeah.
know, it's a different experience. You know, I think it's again that kind of weird, or it's the nod to somatics around like touch and kind of, you know, in somatic forms, you know, you do the most basic way of becoming present with another body is through touch. You know, you just, and sometimes it can just be enough for someone to be like, well, you know,
Right.
And that's like obviously, you know, something that we deal with all the time in culture in relationship to emotions and grief and love and support and difficulty, you know, is that we just kind of connect physically. And, you know, without it getting too, you know,
No.
new agey, it seemed important to have something like that in the piece.
And it was interesting when you mentioned New Agey, because that moment rode this interesting line between parody and complete sincerity.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
was that intent? I mean, you
Yeah,
know,
I mean, I think it's how could you not feel both things in
Right,
a way?
yeah.
I think there is always a kind of self-consciousness now in culture around sincerity. You know, sincerity is given such a such a bad rap, you know, in many forms, and I you know, there's so much you know, there's so much sort of value given to like you know, commenting on what's real, or commenting, editorializing your feelings. And you know, I have that as much as, you know, I love to be cynical, and I love to be sort of like talking
Jaded
smack, and you
yeah.
know, I can do that whole
Right.
thing. You know, I both, you know, inside of the enjoyment of that from like a legacy of queer performance, and then also from like, you know, living in New York, which is like, you know, we really perfect the art of you know, the aside. But at the end of the day, I need to know what's real. Like, I need to know what's really happening with me and another person, you know, with a lover or a friend or a family member.
Yeah.
And, you know, I think maybe this is also harkens to my family, you know,
Right.
like my parents, you know, there isn't really a space for cynicism anymore with them. And, you know,
Because of their age. And
because of their age,
and
because of
the
just who they are.
relationship,
They never have been particularly cynical people.
Right.
I mean, they have great senses of humor, but there's, you know, it's very what you see is what you get with them, and I've always loved that about them, and I've always sort of have loved that I have absorbed that from them, so that, you know, I feel like I bring that into my just kind of the way I am in the art world, and I
Right.
think I used to be a lot more. I think I've gotten better at this because I've come to understand, you know, like, you know, the sensitivity of different situations. But, you know, I think there was a time there when I was like, if I can't just say exactly what I feel all the time, then I don't want to be part of this world, you know? And then I sort of like grew to understand that, like, well, there's a time and a place, you know, and, you know, I can say it here to this person, and maybe it's not great to say, you know, and not because I'm like machinating anything, but just because, like, you grow up and you realize, like, you don't have to say everything you feel all fucking day long,
Right.
you know?
Yeah.
Within the work, you know, I think there is this kind of acknowledgement of the importance of a relationship to truth and sincerity and honesty. But, you know, to not problematize it in any way would also be problematic. You know,
Right,
like it would be
right.
like to not sort of say like, yeah, I also know it's tricky.
Yeah,
You know,
right.
like it's to, you know, and I think
It's a very
I do
difficult
ride that.
line to walk, because
Yeah.
you do it, but it doesn't feel, you problematize it, but it doesn't feel like you're doing it with a nod and a wink. Like,
No,
here's-
I
you know,
don't
and,
live there because I get bored by that kind of
Yeah,
approach
right,
too. And
yeah.
and I see that in other work. I see that there's a real cleverness or a real kind of like distance or kind of aloofness from it. And it's kind of like,
Yeah.
oh, come on, you know, it's like the person who wants to be clever and you just want to like smack them a little bit and just
Right.
be like, just fucking shut
Or it
up,
just
or
gets old quickly,
relax,
yeah.
or just like, just join the group. Like, it's like, what are you gaining by standing outside there? You know, I mean,
Right.
I guess that's my, you know, I mean, I have this tattoo that says participate, you know, partly to remind myself from being mindful of that standing outside and being kind of like too like, you
Right,
know,
right.
because there's a real, that can just be a role that you're playing
Right.
because you think that there's some cachet or power in standing outside of things, and like, you know, and poor you, nobody sees you and understands you, and it's like that's a story you can be just telling yourself,
Right.
as an artist, as a person in the world. And
Yeah.
I have grown to understand that for me that is not a useful narrative, and so that you know, I do feel like in the work I am trying to access things in people that do bring us together, like that we do share, and that's again, you know, a really scary thing to talk. You know, you can't use the word universal. You can't say that, and I'm not claiming that it's universal, but you know, to sort of suggest that people don't feel sadness or joy, like that
Right.
everyone doesn't have a capacity for that in one direction or the other, it would be an absurd statement. You know, like to sort of, yeah, I'm not going to presume that it looks like this for this person or it looks like that for that person, but to sort of deny the fact that that is available to people would also, I think, be irresponsible.
When you mentioned a minute ago about, you know, the influence of, or how your relationship with your family, and you dedicated this work to your
Yeah.
immediate family.
Yeah.
You also created in essence, what felt like a family on stage.
Yes, absolutely.
With these remarkable performers. And
Yeah.
could you talk a little bit about that relationship, or why you dedicated the work to your family at this moment in time, and secondarily, how over these years of making this work, this family became what it was.
Yeah. Well, I think that when you work in dance or performance or ensemble work of any kind, you know, it doesn't have to be dance, obviously. Although dance does have a specificity to it in that we, you know, we do something very strange. We come into rooms and we, like I said, we roll around and we touch each other, and, you know, at least in the way that I work, there's a lot of conviviality and a lot of social time, and because the work is made over a long span of time, we really like end up sharing a lot about ourselves with each other, and you know, as our lives change, you know, people's personal lives, it all gets in there, you know,
right.
it all comes into the room.
And this work had performers you had regularly worked with, like Michelle and
Yeah,
things,
yeah.
as well as people who you
that I hadn't worked with before, exactly. And so, I mean, from a directorial perspective, that conviviality for me is critical to the health of a process. Because I do feel like, again, this is just me, this is the way I like to work, but I like to create a shared, implicated space, you know, where we're all invested in the ideas together. And the only way that that can happen is if there's a kind of love and emotional energy that's coming together around, like, well, we want to make this thing happen, you know, and that's, which is, yes, like, there's money and there's institutional support that makes it happen too. But at the end of the day, the thing that makes it happen is this thing that happens between people sort of agreeing to say, yes, I will participate in this thing and make it happen. So that becomes obviously a constructed family, you know, and there's dynamics that form within that. And then there's the sort of container of a piece that you're making, fine. And then the way that that piece is sort of in conversation with everything that's happening outside of the room, you know, in
people's lives,
in people's lives, and specifically in my life, since I'm, you know,
right.
directing the project. And because, you know, there was this kind of central thing happening in my personal life around my relationship to my family and my dad's difficulties, neurological difficulties, you know, somewhere in the project, in the process of the piece earlier this year, I was like, oh my God, I am creating a family situation on stage. You know, I'm creating like a matrix of the family here, and, you know, Ishmael representing something, KJ representing something, Hillary representing something, and then, you know, Luke and Michelle being these kind of peripheral sort of guards, or, you know, spirit guides,
yeah.
you know, you could say.
Yeah.
And I was like, I mean, I was talking about this earlier with someone today. I was like, at first I was mortified to find that out. I was like, no, that did not happen. No. I did not walk into this piece. You know, not when I was casting it was I thinking that.
Right.
Not was I, you know, there was no conscious decision around that. So that's just an example of how a piece sort of surprises you,
right.
and takes you to a direction that you're like, oh my God, this is what's actually coming up. And again, you can be like, no, I'm not going to acknowledge that, and, you know, make the piece something else. And I could have done that. Or as I did, I was like, okay, yeah, that's what's happening here. Like, it would be kind of crazy to say otherwise. And you know, so it felt very. I started to realize, you know, that this piece is more than almost any other piece. I am projecting things onto individuals. You know, like, it's like I'm having like my life going on, right? And then it's kind of going, and then it's just like prism, you know, and it's like these intense projections that then mingles with obviously each performer's individual investment and trajectory with their process with this piece, and with what they bring to it, because they're not, you know, these are not blank canvases.
Right.
These are performers that are not, you know, these are performers with very specific, you know, presences and very specific histories, yeah, and very rich. They're like, you know, I didn't have to teach anybody how to perform, you know, in this project, for sure. And that was a casting interest. You know, that was a very specific interest that I had of, like, I want to have these, like, people who are really, like, you know, that they're solid, you know.
But that must also add an interesting tension, or I'm just curious about watching you directing toward the end of the work, really refining down to the hand gesture or the beat, you know, and then you have strong performers, most of whom are their own creators, create their own work as well.
Sure.
How did you balance? I mean, you didn't seem to have any problem directing this cast of folks who have their very own distinct, you know, individual creative lives.
Yeah, trust. You have to build trust. You know, you create a sense of trust where you understand that to direct someone is not to control them, but to direct them. You know, in the same way that you would direct traffic. You know, if everybody just kind of like went anywhere and there were no red lights, you know, we wouldn't be able to function. You know,
Right.
and the red lights are not there to like say "fuck you, you can't go."
Yeah.
The red light's there to say like, "Hey, not right now yet."
Right.
You know,
Yeah.
you'll get a green light. You just might have to wait 20 seconds. You know, and it's like you're not. You know, you're not. I'm not trying to suppress anything, but I am because I'm driving the thing, and because I'm interested in driving the thing, because I want the responsibility of driving it.
Right.
And I accept that responsibility. Then if I'm going to accept that, if I'm going to ask someone into that, then I also have a certain responsibility to be clear with them about what I want to what I would like to make happen in the work.
Right.
And that, again, it's not, but that can be generous. That's a
Yeah.
generous act. That's not I want to
No.
turn you into, no, it's not a malicious or like a tyrannical act. It is
Well,
what,
and in fact,
you know,
it seemed like there was such a sense of, you know, trust, even go so far to say love in the room
Yeah.
around how you guys work together.
Yeah, I
And,
mean, I think most people, at least most performers, you know, want to know what should be going
Right.
on.
Yes,
I mean, I think
right.
like there's like
Yeah.
a desire to know,
Yeah.
and there's a real excitement around being led. You know,
Yeah.
I mean, if you go to like a yoga class, you know, you're not going just to kind of do your own thing in the corner.
Right.
You're going to be guided.
Yeah.
You know, because there's a difference in what it is to be guided and what someone is able to get out of you in that process.
Yeah.
You know, I realized that many years ago as a performer when I was, you know, working with someone who was really able to kind of, you know, demand really specific things from me, and I was able to say, wow, this is really useful.
Yeah.
Like, because it doesn't feel, it invites me into corners of myself that I wouldn't have gone to. You know, if we were just only like, well, I'm just going to direct myself and I'm just going to do exactly what I want, it's like, you're perceiving that somehow you are going to get to every part of you.
Right.
But you getting to you is only you getting to you through your random experience of what you think you is.
Right.
And the beauty of being in the world and with other subjects and other people is that they can see things about you that you can't. And so they can invite things from you that you would not necessarily invite from yourself. And you know, those are like two huge directorial lessons that I've gotten over
And
the
then
last
you've
few
got
years.
6 of you,
Yeah.
of which the intersection between bodies and histories and physicality, you can play off. You're playing around those combinations.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Constantly.
Yeah, no, I didn't pick like the 5 people who dance most like me.
Right.
That wasn't the case for this show. I
Yeah.
mean, you know, that may happen for a different show for different reasons, but for this show, it wasn't. It didn't. There is a shared sensibility, and I do feel like there's a shared sort of value and an energy around around this particular piece. I think inside of the piece.
Yeah.
So I'm not, you know, which also was built over time and,
Yeah.
and through the explorations that we did. So I'm not really that worried about that. But I'm also happy to know that, like, you know, in the same way that, like, you know, you in a novel, you would be like, oh, now there's this person, and you're just like, oh, I can't stand when that person, but I want to know more, you know, and it's like, you know, you get kind of into this emotional relationship to these people.
Right. You also chose some of the finest improvisers,
Yeah.
and I wanted to ask about, you know, the language that you used in the work. I was talking to one of the performers, and they said that you were, and seeing it the second time, it became clear that you had people improvise through the creative process, then recorded the improvisations, and then asked people to learn those improvisations.
Yeah.
And what were the challenges around? Because in some ways, people look to improvisation for the spontaneity and the in-the-momentness, and then you kind of remove the in-the-momentness.
Yeah.
And so,
Yeah.
but on the other hand, created a very unusual language in a certain way because it was drawing from something that was initially improvised.
Yeah, I think it is like the most hateful and excruciating thing to tell people to like replicate movement from improvisation on video. Like it is like one of the more tedious, awful ways of working, and it's like, boy, if you want to kill the energy in a room, that's like a great way to do it.
So why did you
why do it? Because I just think it has a different value than movement that is improvisation has a lot more digital possibility in that value kind of rises and falls very quickly, directions shift, just like like things that are kind of insignificant suddenly have a lot of significance. The thing that, there is no real idea of transition because you're acknowledging real time, right? So that value can get really brought into the movement itself. Now, if you stand up in front of a group of people and start to make movement, which can be really rich and beautiful, I'm a huge lover of people who have
formal
sophisticated
set
vocabularies. I mean, I think for me, one of the most interesting ones in the last 50 years is like Trisha Brown, obviously. In terms of like a vocabulary that emerges from the singular body, right? That whole trope of choreographic production. Very few other kinds of choreographers have made as interesting movement for me as that. I think John Jaspers is another one,
right,
who is just like is a real carpenter of movement, and I think that kind of that for me at least is often the case that kind of approach creates a sort of kind of like analog value around the movement, like this leads to this, which proposes a certain kind of harmony, a kind of integrity and harmony.
In the world?
In the body itself.
Uh-huh.
And there's a kind of way in which you, even as a dancer, when you learn that kind of movement, you're really embedded, you're really invested in the success of this then functioning into this and to this. Now, when you extract movement from improvisation, or at least the kind of improvisations that we were doing, because you could do these kind of beautiful, successful improvisations, what you're valuing there and what you're extracting is this kind of like,
right.
and I think particularly like in this piece, one of the places where I think that's most evident is the duet between Luke and Hillary later in the piece in the music, and it's like that stuff. It's like so like weird and thorny, and if you were really to look at the movement, some of it's like so banal, but then there's like this drive, this energetic drive that's being put into it,
right.
that kind of. And they're just constantly shifting, and they're moving apart, and they're coming back together, and it's like you're not really sure why they care so much, and it's like, but you're like caught up in this thing, or at least that's what happens to me when I watch it, and I feel like that kind of value around time with movement could only have come from improvisation, because there is an alacrity, and a strangeness of mind that happens with improvisation around direction and value and kind of gesture and sudden ephemeral emotionalism, and again, sometimes when you go into analog movement or set constructed movement, you not only set a kind of temporal value right away, but an emotional value right away that then gets kind of it just carries through. And so the entire phrase is only going to be inside, either it's like desperate and blah, blah, or it's going to be beautiful, or it's going to be heroic.
Right.
And it's going to be like the container of that emotion is going to exist within the container of the vocabulary from start to finish. Like maybe different dynamic things will happen, but the overall value is going to be the same. Whereas in improvisation, you can really fuck with that value. You can
right.
chop it up, you can slice it, you can have something super beautiful and then follow it with a vernacularism or a banal act.
Is that because or is there also the power that in improvisation people are tapping into more of an unconscious?
I think there's there's a kind of even though, well, in this piece, the improvisational sections, which are there's not tons of it, I mean, everything came from improvisation, but in terms of what's actually happening in the piece that's improvised, we don't have tons of language wrapped into what they are about. So yes, there's this kind of panic of real-time enactment,
Right.
which I think is really interesting. To watch, or
right.
I'm always intrigued by this thing of okay, I don't know what's gonna happen,
Right.
and then there's that just creates a certain kind of it's a certain vibration in a room, and in this piece, I love that we kind of shift back and forth between those values of this is really unknown, this is actually quite known, but the quite known thing may or may not look like it's known,
right?
There's a couple I feel like a lot of Michelle's material.
Yeah, there's sections.
In the piece. You're just is she
don't,
just making it up?
Right. I know, and I think the audience also is on that edge of is this just all totally in the moment, or
sure? And yeah, we had that question last night. What somebody. Oh, and a local artist, she was like, so is the whole piece improvised, and we're like, no, it's all pretty or I was just is the whole piece set? We're like, no, it's just either direction of the answer was kind of confusing, and it's again, I guess for me, it harkens back to that kind of collegistic value of taking different modes of working and kind of saying, okay, let's put them together. And I think I don't this sort of artificial problem between what is improvised and what is choreographed. I'm I don't fucking care. They're not they're different approaches, yes, and I'm not denying that there are different approaches, but I'm it's all there. Or the idea of the dancer who can speak. Oh my God, you can speak, you can sing.
You can act,
people are oh my God, it's of course I can speak. Everybody can speak, and so it's just these kinds of removing any sort of supposition that you can't move easily back and forth between.
Speaking of speaking, there's the whole section where you use people on book.
Very
conscious. Could you talk about
that?
That, and the laugh track is in it, and you guys are laughing in unison by instruction in the text.
Yeah. Well, that text is a reworking. Boru did a kind of a rewriting of these George Berkeley, who was this, I think he's called materialist philosopher from, oh gosh, I can't remember the era, 1700s or something. He wrote this thing called the Three Dialogues between Hylas and Philonous, and where he's kind of arguing about, he's sort of showing how basically everything is created in the mind. That's his whole sort of thing.
Right.
And that the senses are totally unreliable. I mean, that's the part that we've really extracted for the purposes of this piece. There's a lot going on. But and
very clear. But then it all
falls apart,
right?
Because for me, I think reading that, what happened was I was at Mancy, this residency center in Florida, and I visited a philosophy class, and that day they happened to be talking about those dialogues, and I was listening to it, and I was very confused. I was trying to read it, and I was like, this is really fucking confusing, But the thing that I got the most out, the thing that really emerged for me was this thing of wow, you can really make anything true with language. You can prove to someone that they're not having the experience that they're having. You can talk someone out of their own embodied experience, which is really disturbing. Right? And kind of amazing about language. You can do a geometric proof. And as we do, it's I prove to him that, there is no such thing as sensation. Right. There's no difference between sensing and ideas. And that the brain itself is not a thing. Because it's only an idea.
Right.
So if the brain is only idea, then that I'm thinking about, then how can I ever know that it's a thing? Right. So it's he just fucks, my character completely fucks the other guy out of any relationship to the senses, and it's well, we know a white curtain exists. It's but you don't, because if you were to get really close to that curtain, you would see, well, there's green, there's purple, there's blue, there's and if you go far away, it's going to be different. So what's real? Right. Because well, I know it exists because I can see it. Yeah, but what you can see isn't stable. Yeah. And we're going to leave here and we're turn the lights off, so it's not going to be there anymore. So it's this whole
which gets back to, it seems like this power, the way that language is used to dominate the body.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I was interested in sort of saying like, look, you all want words to mean something. You know, we all want them to sort of ground us in reality, but they're really, yeah, they're not trustworthy per se, or they're not. It's not like they're not trustworthy. I mean, that's been talked about forever, right? With like post-structuralist theory, but it's like they're they're just one. They're just part of it. You know, they're just part of a larger thing. And um, and I, again, in that particular section, there's kind of the interest in the enactment of speech, and also the kind of consciousness of like, these are words on a page. These are ideas that that are sort of constructed,
Right.
you know, and that's why it felt important to kind of have them be like it's a scripted thing, you know. It's not like we're just trying to do it. It's like, no, this is like a really, like it is artificial.
And if you had taken the books out of people's hands, suddenly they would be this sense of just acting.
Yeah. This gets to be more like acting class, like weird rehearsal, and I think there is always there has often been in the work some sort of, again, that like the enjoyment of the middle of a process as the end. You know, like this idea that like somehow everything is always working towards like this final product, and then the final product, you know, there's no seams, there's no, you know, you don't see the stitches, you don't see and it's like, no, but that construction is so, to observe that, you know, and this is a value that's huge in visual art, you know, and that we see the making
reveal.
So I feel like that was important.
How do you feel now that, as we run out of time here, the work is done, and I wondered if you could just comment on what you found to be the biggest joy or the biggest challenge in making this piece.
Well, I think the biggest joy for me, to be perfectly honest, is the interaction I get to have with the people I work with. Because I do think as an artist, I'll speak for myself. I don't want to speak for anyone else, but I know that I have the tendency to think that, you know, I would be better off if I was just by myself and, you know, just having my ideas alone in a corner in a room with no one to bother me. Right? Like, you know, there's like this kind of,
because you do make these solo pieces that
I do make solos, which is like, you know, that's like great. Careful what you ask for, because then you're touring a solo and you're like in a room by yourself, miserable. So I'm like, yay, group pieces. But I do think that there's something so, like, I mean, just to live inside of a society of generosity and trust for the amount of time that one gets to when you're making something, and then to perform it. You know, I mean, it's in a way the closest experience, and therefore somehow the most joyful, because it is so, because I mean, just to be honest, like it just kind of carries you through the fucking day.
Yeah.
You know, like it just carries you through. And I think that's something that really came up for me, you know, as things were happening in my family and difficulties were emerging, was like, you know, what do you have to get through this stuff? All you have is each other. Like all you have is the people. That's all you have. You know, like, you know, yeah, you can read a book, you can, you know, talk to that person, but like, it's just going to be like this person carrying you through, and you on your own is not enough. It's just not enough. And it shouldn't be. Like there's no reason it should be. So I think that that's been the most joyful thing, and probably the most difficult thing is, you know, it's always embarrassing in a way as an artist to be like, yeah, this is what I have to offer you. You know, like there's a kind of embarrassment almost in letting someone else in. You know, there's both. I mean, I feel really.
Do you mean that both your collaborators as well as the audience?
Yeah, and everyone. You know, like this is in the world, and like, hi, this is me. You know, this is me now, or this is a certain aspect of me. You know, and you know, to kind of, as you approach a premiere, and then you do a premiere, and you sort of like, you're starting to have objectivity as a maker as well, and I'm in a really weird role because I'm in my own work, you know, which just puts me in a really strange relationship to it, where I'm trying to navigate an outside-inside dynamic. So I'm sort of in it and following somatically the desires of where the work wants to go, but then I'm also outside of it and like organizing things visually, and I'm like, wow, okay, yeah, this is that. Oh, wow, this is the piece. Like, this is what all that mumbo jumbo that we've been talking about for the last X number of years, like, this is what it became, And it's
Right.
kind of like, there's a kind of like getting caught with your pants down feeling sometimes of just like, yeah, this is it.
Kind of a finality of
Yeah,
it.
and I don't know. Yeah, a sense of finality, and just in as much as like that, this is where the work got to. This is, I don't. I mean, the thing that that gives me permission to sort of accept that is knowing that it in fact is not final, because I am going to make other work, and I'm going to continue. And I have.
You mean not that you're gonna keep working on this?
No.
Yeah.
But I'm going to make other things, and also I have this sits somewhere inside of a larger body of work, and I am, I mean, I think I've said this before. It's like, in a way, it's wonderful, but also strange that an audience's relationship to your work is just these brief landings with what they happen to see, if it gets to their city or not,
Right.
And so then they're kind of like, oh, well, I've seen that person's work, and it's kind of like, well, you've seen that piece, and
Yeah.
you've seen their work in the sense like the value of that artist is there, but I do feel like I'm beginning to understand now, as I go into my 40s, it's like, there's a whole story that's happening with
Right.
the pieces, and as they come, and then there's like the little splinter pieces, and then there's like the little pieces, and then there's like the
Yeah.
experience I have as a teacher, and then there's the kind of like the interactions I have with people just like in interviews or talks. Like, there's all these different ways in which I'm experiencing myself as a person making work now. And for me, as the central subject of that experience, I'm aware of like, yeah, this is just one thing. But then I also teach deep aerobics, and then I also do Heavens, and then I also had that show I did 5 years ago, and then I had this next thing I'm going to do, and then I did that, show at that small space. It's like I'm moving this way. Like, there's the kind of solidity, or the proposition that this is somehow the solidity.
Right.
And I'm kind of like, it's not for me. I mean,
Right.
it is, because it's like a certain scale.
It's a premiere, and
it's a premiere. It's a certain situation that's very solid.
Right.
But I'm kind of like really conscious of being in all these other, relationships to my practice, and what I like to do. So yeah.
Well, Miguel, I want to thank you for taking this time and for bringing us this work. And
Thank you for having us, and thank you for commissioning it, and we're so thrilled to be here. We love Minneapolis, so yeah.
Thanks, Miguel.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks. Bye.
Bye.